The blade was a sliver of winter moonlight, a cold promise held in a warm hand. It was not a weapon meant for this room. It was a carving knife, long and elegant, its silver handle chased with ivy, its purpose to slice through the succulent flesh of the Christmas goose steaming on the platter. Now it rested against the throat of Judge Thaddeus Hemlock. For a frozen second, no one moved. The air, thick with the scent of pine needles, beeswax, and roasted fowl, became a solid thing, trapping the moment like an insect in amber. The judge's eyes, the color of muddy water, widened in disbelief. They were fixed on the face of the man holding the knife, his house slave Ezekiel, a man he had owned for 20 years, a man who had dressed him that very morning, who had polished the silver he now held, who had stood silent and invisible in the corner of this very room for 1,000 such suppers. Ezekiel's face was a mask of calm, a terrifying placidity that was more chilling than any snarl of rage. His knuckles were white where he gripped the handle. His thumb rested on the judge's pulse, a soft, frantic bird beating against its cage. The mistress, Eleanor Hemlock, let out a small, choked sound, a mouse's squeak. Her porcelain white hand, laden with rings, flew to her mouth. The two dinner guests, a cotton factor from Augusta and his pallid wife, were statues of shock, their forks hovering halfway to their mouths. Ezekiel, the judge rasped, the word a bubble of air and disbelief. What is the meaning of this? Ezekiel said nothing. His world had narrowed to the thrumming vein beneath the blade, the smell of the judge's bay rum cologne, the spidery web of broken capillaries on his cheek. He saw not the man, but a ledger filled with names. His Baerolaria's wife's name Elara, signed away for $200 and a carriage horse. His daughter's name, Sparrow, a footnote on the same bill of sale, valued at no more than a sack of corn. The judge's handwriting, a cruel, spidery script, had been the instrument of that amputation, a flick of the wrist that had severed his soul. He had seen that same script just last week. A letter left open on the judge's desk. An inquiry from a planter in Louisiana. Nowhere regarding the girl, Sparrow. She is developing into a fine specimen. Strong-backed and comely. Will fetch a good price when she comes of age. The words had burned themselves behind Ezekiel's eyes. Comely. Specimen. A price. His little girl, who used to chase fireflies in the dusk, whose laughter was like the chiming of tiny bells. His Sparrow. He pressed the blade. A line of crimson, shockingly bright against the starched white collar, bloomed on the judge's neck. A collective gasp filled the room. The judge's hands, soft and manicured, scrabbled at Ezekiel's arm, but there was no strength in them. It was the grip of a startled child. Ezekiel pulled the knife in a single, smooth motion, a gesture as practiced and economical as serving wine. The sound was not loud. It was a wet, tearing whisper, the sound of canvas ripping. The judge gurgled, a sound of profound surprise. His eyes rolled back, and he slumped forward, his face crashing into a plate of glazed yams and cranberries. The damask tablecloth, a field of white poppies, drank the red. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of dripping. Then the mistress screamed. It was not a ladylike shriek, but a raw, animal sound of pure terror. The cotton factor's wife fainted, sliding from her chair with a soft thud. Her husband scrambled backward, his chair toppling with a crash that finally broke the spell. Silverware clattered. A wine glass shattered. Ezekiel did not look at them. He dropped the bloody knife onto the polished floor. It rang once, a stark, metallic note. He turned and walked from the room. Not ran. Walked. His stride was measured, his back straight. He walked through the grand foyer, past the towering Christmas tree, whose candles flickered and danced, casting long, wavering shadows. He walked past the portrait of the judge's father, a man with the same muddy eyes and cruel set to his mouth. He walked out the heavy oak doors, which he had polished that morning, and did not close them behind him. He stepped out into the cold December night, the air a shock to his lungs, and only then, as the screams from the house faded behind him and the vast star-dusted darkness of the Georgia Lowcountry swallowed him whole, did he begin to run. He ran not toward the slave cabins, a place of temporary solace but ultimate capture. He ran toward the river, toward the black tangled maw of the cypress swamp that bordered the hemlock plantation. The dogs would come soon. He knew the sounds, the deep, guttural bays of the bloodhounds, the sharp, frantic yaps of the tracking curs. He knew the men who would follow: Silas Croft, the overseer, a man whose cruelty was as casual and constant as the tides. He would lead the patrol, his face lit with a righteous fury that was little more than sanctified bloodlust. The ground was cold and wet beneath his thin shoes. Brambles tore at his livery, the fine wool coat and trousers that marked him as property of the house. He ripped the coat off, letting it fall to the mud. It was a skin he was shedding. In his pocket, his fingers found the small, hard object he always carried: a shora, single, chipped pearl button, tiny and iridescent. It was from the collar of the last dress his daughter had worn, a small scrap of blue calico. He had found it in the dust of their cabin floor the morning after they were taken. He closed his fist around it, the sharp edges digging into his palm. The pain was a grounding thing, a reminder. This was for Sparrow. The air grew thick with the smell of decay and damp earth, the primal scent of the swamp, the sweet, cloying fragrance of night-blooming jasmine, a ghost on the wind, pricked his memory. It had grown on a trellis outside the cabin he had shared with Alara. On hot summer nights, its perfume had been so strong it felt like you could taste it. Ilara had said it was the smell of secrets, of things that only showed their true selves in the dark. He pushed the memory away. Memory was a weight, and he needed to be light. He could hear them now, a distant horn, a signal from the great house. Then the first howl of a dog, long and mournful, answered by a chorus of others. The hunt had begun. He plunged deeper into the swamp, the cold water seeping into his shoes, sucking at his ankles. The cypress knees rose from the black water like the bones of drowned giants. Spanish moss hung from the branches like the gray, tangled hair of witches. This was a place of fear, a place slaves were told would swallow them whole, a place filled with snakes and gators and things far worse. But tonight, it was not a prison. It was a sanctuary. The terrors of the swamp were known, honest. The true monsters were the ones in the fine houses, with their polite smiles and their spidery, damning handwriting. Ezekiel clutched the pearl button in his pocket and vanished into the darkness, the sounds of the baying hounds growing closer, a promise of the reckoning to come. Silas Croft stood over the body, the stench of blood and cooling food thick in his nostrils. The mistress was being tended to upstairs, her hysterics echoing through the house. The guests had been bustled away, their faces pale and slack with shock. It was just him and the judge, or what was left of him. The man's face was half submerged in a congealing pool of gravy and blood. Croft felt a flicker of disgust but no pity. The judge had been a hard man, but a predictable one. His cruelty was a known quantity. This, however, was something else. This was an affront to the natural order of things. "Get the dogs," Croft said to one of the field hands who had been summoned, his voice a low growl. "Rouse every man on this property. And send word to the neighboring plantations. I want patrols on every road, every ferry crossing from here to the coast." He knelt, careful not to get the judge's blood on his trousers, and picked up the carving knife. He wiped the blade on the stained tablecloth. It was the house silver, heavy and ornate. That Ezekiel, the quiet, almost invisible one, had used this, a tool of their own opulence, was an insult that stung almost as much as the murder itself. Croft had never trusted Ezekiel. He was literate, for one thing. The old mistress had taught him his letters before the judge put a stop to it, but the damage was done. A literate slave was like a loaded gun with a faulty trigger. You never knew when it might go off. And Ezekiel had a stillness about him, an unnerving way of watching and listening that Croft had always mistaken for docility. It was arrogance he saw now, the arrogance of a creature that believed it was more than it was. Silas. The voice was thin, reedy. It was Mr. Hemlock, the judge's younger brother, summoned from his nearby estate. He was a nervous, bird-like man who lived in the judge's shadow. "My God, Silas, what happened?" Ezekiel, Croft said, the name like a curse on his tongue, slit his throat at the supper table, right in front of everybody. The younger Hemlock paled, his eyes darting around the room as if Ezekiel might still be lurking in the shadows. "He must be found. He must be made an example of. This cannot stand. It will give the others ideas." "He will be found," Croft promised, his hand tightening on the knife. "And when he is, what's left of him will hang from the highest branch of the hanging tree for a month. Ideas die when they see a body swing." He went to the judge's study. The room was a monument to the man's power. Law books bound in dark leather, a heavy mahogany desk, the faint smell of tobacco and whiskey. On the desk lay the judge's ledger, its pages filled with that distinctive, spidery script. Croft flipped through it, his finger tracing the columns of names and figures. He found the entry from 6 years ago. Alara, sold to MSSR Dubois, Orleans Parish, $200. With child, Sparrow. And there it was, the motive. Croft had always said selling off family was bad for business. It soured the stock, but the judge had been short on funds, and the offer had been too good. He remembered Ezekiel's face that week. It hadn't been angry or sad. It had been empty. A house with all the furniture removed. That was the face he'd worn for 6 years. Until tonight. Croft took a piece of parchment, dipped a fresh quill in the judge's inkwell, and began to write. He was no scholar, but he knew the words that mattered. Quanted, runaway slave, name, Ezekiel, age approx. 40 years, height 6 feet, slender build but strong, scar above left eye, well-spoken for his kind, can read and write, last seen wearing house livery, though may have discarded it. Crime, the brutal and unprovoked murder of his master, Judge Thaddeus Hemlock. Reward, $300 for his capture, alive. $400 for proof of his death. He paused, the quill hovering over the paper. The judge's ink felt strange, potent. He was wielding the man's power now. He added a final, vicious flourish. Said slave is cunning and extremely dangerous. Approach with all caution. He has forfeited any claim to mercy. Give him none. He signed it. Silas Croft, overseer, Hemlock Plantation. He would have copies made and sent to every town, every courthouse, every slave patrol, from Savannah to the Florida border. The world would shrink around Ezekiel. There would be no place to hide. The paper, the ink, the very words of the world were now aligned against him, a net of handwriting closing in. The swamp was a living thing, breathing mist in the cold night air. Ezekiel moved through it, not with the panic of a fugitive, but with the grim purpose of a man who had already died once and had nothing left to lose but the ghost he had become. He moved by instinct, following the faint animal trails, keeping the North Star over his left shoulder whenever a break in the canopy allowed. The water was a constant icy shock, numbing his feet, his legs, his very bones. But the cold was a companion. It kept the memories at bay. It kept him in the now. The sounds of the hunt were a constant presence. The baying of the dogs would swell on the wind, a wave of terror, then recede, giving him a few precious moments of silence before cresting again. They were casting a wide net, he knew. Croft was not a fool. He would assume Ezekiel would make for the river, try to find a boat, or head for the port at Savannah. So Ezekiel did neither. He went deeper into the swamp, into the heart of the Great Dismal, a place where patrols were reluctant to go, where a man could disappear for good. He thought of Alara. He couldn't help it. The scent of jasmine was everywhere tonight, as if the swamp itself was dreaming of her. He remembered teaching her the letters, scratching them in the dirt with a stick. He remembered her tracing the scar above his eye, a gift from the judge's riding crop, and whispering, "This is the map of what you've survived." He remembered the first time he'd held Sparrow, a tiny, perfect thing, her fist curled around his finger. Her first word had been his name. Grief was a physical thing, a stone in his gut. But tonight it was also fuel. For 6 years it had been a cold, dead weight. The murder had set it on fire. The rage was clean now, pure. It burned away the fear. He was no longer just a man running from something. He was a man running face something, though he did not know what it was. An idea. A place where a man was not a name in a ledger. A place where his daughter was not a specimen. Sometime before dawn he stumbled upon it. A small island of solid ground. A hummock of earth crowned by a massive, ancient cypress. At its base, the roots had twisted and grown together to form a hollow, a natural den shielded from view by curtains of Spanish moss. It was damp and smelled of wet earth, but it was shelter. He crawled inside, his body screaming with exhaustion, and huddled in the darkness. He took out the pearl button. In the faint pre-dawn light, it shimmered with a soft, milky glow. He rubbed its smooth surface with his thumb. It was so small, a tiny, insignificant thing to anchor a life to. He remembered the day Alara had sewn it onto Sparrow's dress, her fingers, nimble and sure, pushing the needle through the calico. Sparrow had been fidgeting, trying to catch a sunbeam in her hands. "Be still, little bird," Alara had murmured, her voice a low, gentle lullaby. "Let Mama make you beautiful." The memory was so sharp, so vivid, it was like a knife in his heart. He curled into a tight ball, the button pressed against his lips, and for the first time since he had walked out of that dining room, he allowed himself to feel the full, crushing weight of what he had done and what he had lost. The dogs were closer now, their howls echoing across the water, the sound of a world that would never stop hunting him. He did not weep. Tears were a luxury he could not afford. He simply lay in the dark, a man hollowed out by grief and fury, and waited for the sun to rise on a world that wanted him dead. For 2 days, the swamp was his world. He ate nothing. He drank the black, tannin-stained water, scooping it into his cupped hands. He moved only at night, navigating by the stars and the feel of the ground beneath his bare feet. He had lost his shoes in the thick mud of a bog. During the day, he would hide, sometimes submerged up to his neck in the cold water, breathing through a hollow reed, the sounds of the patrol passing terrifyingly close. He heard their voices, Croft's unmistakable bark, the jingle of harnesses, the splashing of horses. They spoke of him as if he were an animal, a rabid wolf to be put down. "He's in here somewhere," he heard Croft say, his voice seeming to come from just feet away. "He can't have gone far. No food, no weapon. The swamp will bosses. Either kill him or drive him out to us." Ezekiel remained perfectly still, the water chilling him to the bone. He watched a water moccasin glide silently past his face, its head held regally above the surface. He felt no fear of it. They were both just creatures of the swamp, trying to survive. He was learning the rhythms of this place, its secret language. He learned which roots were slick with deadly moss and which offered a firm hold. He learned to distinguish the grunt of a bullfrog from the bellow of a gator. He was shedding the skin of the house slave, layer by layer, and becoming something else, something harder and wilder. On the third night, driven by a hunger so fierce it felt like a physical blow, he risked leaving the deeper parts of the swamp. He moved toward the edge of a rice plantation he knew bordered the Hemlock lands, a place called Providence. The enslaved people there, he knew, sometimes left offerings of food and aid for runaways in secret, designated spots. A hollow log, a particular stone at a creek's edge. It was a risk. Betrayal was always possible. The reward for his capture was a fortune to a man or woman who had nothing. He moved like a shadow along the edge of the rice fields, the harvested stalks rustling in the wind. The air here was different, carrying the smell of wood smoke and cooked food, a scent that made his stomach cramp with painful longing. He found the spot he was looking for, a trio of cypress trees that grew in a tight-huddled triangle known as the Three Sisters. Tucked into a hollow at the base of the largest tree was a small bundle wrapped in cloth. His heart hammered against his ribs. He unwrapped it. Inside was a piece of cornbread, a salted ham hock, and a small, hard apple. It was a feast. He devoured the food with a desperate, animalistic hunger, not caring that his hands were caked in mud. As he bit into the apple, his teeth hit something hard. He pulled it out. It was a nail, deliberately baked into the fruit. He stared at it, the realization dawning cold and sharp. This was not a gift. It was a trap. A twig snapped behind him. He spun around, his body instantly tensing. A figure emerged from the shadows of the trees. It was an old man, one of the field hands from Providence he recognized but did not know by name. The old man's face was a mask of sorrow and fear. "They know," the old man whispered, his voice trembling. "Croft, he came. He said you'd be hungry. He promised freedom for the one who turned you in." "Freedom?" The word sounded like a curse on his lips. "Where are they?" Ezekiel's voice was a harsh rasp. "Everywhere," the old man said, wringing his hands. "All around. They're closing in. I couldn't do it. My grandson," he heard them talking. "He put the nail in the apple to warn you." A whistle pierced the night, sharp and clear, from the direction of the main house. The signal. "Go!" the old man urged, his eyes wide with terror. "Go now! Follow the creek north. It'll take you away from them. May God have mercy on your soul, son." Ezekiel didn't wait. He plunged into the creek, the icy water a brutal shock, and began to move, half swimming, half wading, using the overgrown banks for cover. Behind him, he heard the eruption of noise, shouts, the baying of dogs growing louder, the crash of men moving through the undergrowth. They were close, so close. The net he had felt closing for days was now being drawn tight. The small act of kindness, the warning from a boy he would never know, had given him a chance, but it was a slim one. He pushed himself harder, his lungs burning, his muscles screaming. The pearl button in his pocket felt heavy, a small stone of impossible weight. He thought of Sparrow. He imagined her grown, her face a mixture of his and Alara's. Would she be free? Would she even know who her father was? Or would he just be a whispered story, a ghost in a tale of blood and rebellion? The thought gave him a fresh surge of strength. He would not be caught. He would not be made an example. His story would not end at the end of a rope his body left for the crows. He didn't know where he was going, or what freedom would even look like if he found it. He only knew that he had to keep moving, one desperate step after another, with the sound of the hunt at his heels and the memory of a little girl's laughter as his only guide. The creek twisted and turned, its banks a tangled mess of roots and thorns that tore at his skin and clothes. The water was a relentless enemy, sapping his warmth, its current trying to pull him down. But it was also his savior, masking his scent from the dogs, their frantic howls growing slightly more distant, confused. He knew it was a temporary reprieve. Croft was a tenacious hunter. He would cast his men up and down the banks, and eventually they would find his trail again. He hauled himself out of the water when he saw the flicker of a distant light through the trees. It was a risk, but staying in the open creek was a greater one. He moved toward the light, his body shivering uncontrollably, every muscle locked in a painful tremor. The light came from a small, dilapidated cabin, little more than a shack, set deep in the woods, far from any main road. It looked abandoned, but the wisp of smoke from its mud and stick chimney said otherwise. He crept closer, his movements slow and deliberate. Through a grimy, cracked window pane, he saw a woman sitting at a rough-hewn table, her back to him. She was humming a low, mournful tune, a spiritual he recognized. On the table, a single candle burned, its flame casting long, dancing shadows. She was alone. He watched her for a long time, his mind racing. She could be a friend, she could be a foe, she could be desperate enough for the reward money to scream at the first sight of him. His hunger, his cold, his sheer exhaustion made the decision for him. He was at the end of his strength. He circled to the front of the cabin and knocked softly on the door. The humming stopped. Silence. "Who's there?" A woman's voice called out, laced with suspicion. Ezekiel's own voice was a dry croak. He had to clear his throat to speak. "I'm a traveler. I'm lost. I mean no harm." It was a weak lie, and they both knew it. No one traveled these woods at night unless they were running from something. He heard the sound of a heavy bar being lifted from the door. It creaked open a few inches. An eye peered out at him. The woman was old, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes sharp and intelligent. She looked him up and down, taking in his torn clothes, the mud and bloodstains, the exhaustion etched into his face. She opened the door wider. "The whole county is looking for a man who looks like you," she said, her voice flat, devoid of judgment. "I know," Ezekiel said. She stared at him for a long moment, a silent negotiation passing between them. Then she nodded once, a quick, sharp gesture. "The dogs won't come through my yard," she said. "I keep things here they don't like." She gestured to the strange assortment of gourds, bundles of herbs, and glass bottles filled with dark liquids hanging from her porch eaves. "Get inside before you bring them down on us both." He stumbled into the cabin. The warmth from a small hearth fire was a blessing so profound it almost brought him to his knees. The single room was cluttered but clean, filled with the scent of drying herbs, wood smoke, and something else, something sharp and medicinal. The woman, whose name he would learn was Hagar, was a root doctor, a healer who lived on the fringes, trusted by the enslaved community and feared by the whites, who dismissed her as a practitioner of hoodoo. She gave him a bowl of thin stew and a piece of dry bread, and watched him eat with her unnerving, steady gaze. "You're the one who killed the judge," she said. It wasn't a question. Ezekiel nodded, his mouth full of stew. "He was a poison man," Hagar said, looking into the fire. "Some men are like a blight on the earth. They poison everything they touch. Sometimes the only cure is to cut the root." She looked back at him. "But cutting the root don't mean the vine won't try to choke you." She let him sleep by the fire, on a pallet of straw and old blankets. Before he drifted off into a deep, dreamless sleep, she took a salve from a jar and tended to the cuts on his face and hands. It smelled of pine resin and beeswax, and it soothed the stinging pain. As she worked, she hummed that same low, mournful tune. It was a song Ilara used to sing to Sparrow, a lullaby about a little bird flying home. The notes wrapped around him like a shroud, a bittersweet comfort that ached with the ghosts of his past. He woke to the sound of a horse. Panic seized him, cold and immediate. He sat bolt upright, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Hagar put a calming hand on his shoulder. "Stay down," she whispered. "It's just one rider." Through the crack in the door they watched. It was Silas Croft, alone, his horse picking its way carefully along the overgrown path that led to the cabin. He stopped a few yards away, his eyes scanning the shack and the surrounding woods. He looked like a bird of prey, his gaze sharp and predatory. Hagar stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron, her face a mask of simple, rustic ignorance. "Mornin', Auntie," Croft said, his voice laced with a false, condescending congeniality. Seen anyone pass this way? A tall buck, travels fast. Got himself in a world of trouble. Ain't seen no one, Mr. Croft, Hagar said, her voice quavering slightly, playing the part of a frightened old woman. Just me and my chickens. Ain't no one come this deep in the woods less they's lost or runnin'. Croft's eyes narrowed. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He walked slowly toward the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the strange gourds and charms hanging from the porch. I know you hear things, Hagar. The wind whispers to you. The birds bring you news. The slaves on a dozen plantations come to you for your roots and powders. They talk. He stopped directly in front of her, his shadow falling over her. $300 is a lot of money. More than you'll see in your whole life. Enough to buy a comfortable bed to die in. Inside, Ezekiel's blood ran cold. He could feel the weight of Croft's presence, his suspicion, a physical pressure against the thin wooden walls of the cabin. He braced himself, ready to bolt, to fight, to do anything but be taken. Hagar let out a dry, crackling laugh. Money, she cackled. What good is money to an old woman like me? My bed is the earth, and I'll have it soon enough for free. The spirits, they bring me all I need. She pointed a bony finger at him. But they also bring me warnings, Mr. Croft. They tell me when a dark heart is near, and they're screaming right now. Croft's face hardened. The mask of civility dropped away, revealing the raw contempt beneath. He stared at her for a long, tense moment, then glanced at the cabin door. Ezekiel held his breath. Croft took a step toward it, his hand resting on the pistol tucked into his belt. The world seemed to stop. The chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, everything went silent. There was only the sound of Ezekiel's own heart, a frantic drum against his ribs. This was it, the end of the line. Then, from deep in the woods behind Croft came a shout. Over here, found a track. Hidden, west, toward the river. Croft's head snapped around. He hesitated, his eyes still fixed on the cabin, his instincts warring with the call of his men. The track was a tangible lead. The old woman was just a suspicion, a gut feeling. He made his choice. We ain't done, old woman, he snarled at Hagar. He swung himself back onto his horse and spurred it viciously, galloping back the way he had come, shouting orders to the unseen men in the woods. Ezekiel sagged against the wall, the strength draining out of him. Hagar came back inside, her face grim. She bolted the door. That was a lie, she said. There was no one else out there, just a boy from the Providence place I sent to make a false trail. But it won't buy you much time. Croft's a dog with a bone. He'll be back. You can't stay here. She gave him a sack with a little more food, a small knife, and a pouch of bitter herbs. Chew on these, she said. It'll help kill your scent. Head north. Don't follow the river, follow the stars. There are people, friends, they call themselves, Quakers, who have stations all the way to the Free States. They help folks like you. Look for a house with a quilt hanging on the line, one with a broken wheel pattern. That's the sign. He didn't know how to thank her. The words felt small, inadequate. He looked at her, this strange, fierce old woman who had risked everything for a man she didn't know. Why? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. Hagar looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a deep, ancient sadness in her eyes. My son was sold south 20 years ago, she said softly. He had a scar above his left eye, just like you. I like to think that somewhere, some stranger was kind to my boy. Now go. And don't you ever look back. He left the cabin and plunged back into the wilderness, heading north. The interlude of warmth and safety was over. The hunt was still on. But something had changed. He was no longer entirely alone. A warning from a boy, a meal from a stranger, a lie from an old woman. They were threads of an invisible tapestry of resistance. a network of defiance that existed in whispers and secret signs. He was a part of it now. He clutched the pearl button in his pocket. It was not just a reminder of what he had lost, but of what he was fighting for. He was not just running for himself. He was running for Sparrow, for Hagar's lost son, for the old man at Providence, for every name in the judge's ledger. He was running for the idea that a life was more than just a line of spidery ink on a piece of paper. Days bled into weeks. The Georgia low country gave way to the rolling hills of the Carolinas. Winter tightened its grip, dusting the landscape with frost, then snow. Ezekiel became a creature of the landscape, his skin weathered, his body lean and hard. He learned to read the land like a book, to find shelter in hollow logs and caves, to trap small game, to identify edible roots. He was a ghost, a rumor, moving through the cracks of the world. The bounty poster with its stark description and the name of Silas Croft at the bottom was his constant shadow. He saw it nailed to trees at crossroads, posted in the windows of general stores in the towns he skirted. Ezekiel. Dangerous. Cunning. The words, printed in blocky impersonal type, were a distillation of the judge's spidery script, the system's official narrative of his existence. He was a monster, a thing to be feared and hunted. He tore one down once, in the dead of night, and studied it by the light of the moon. He did not recognize the man described. That man, the house slave, the murderer, was a stranger. He burned the paper, watching the words curl into ash and disappear on the wind. He looked for the signs Hagar had told him about, the quilts with the broken wheel pattern. He found two. The first was a false lead, a simple country wife airing her bedding, her suspicious eyes following him until he disappeared back into the woods. The second, however, was real. It was a small, neat farmstead in the foothills of North Carolina, tucked away in a quiet valley. The quilt hung on the line, its pattern unmistakable. He watched the house for a full day, his instincts on high alert. He saw a plain-faced man in Quaker gray working in the fields, a woman in a simple bonnet tending her garden. There was a quiet, peaceful industry about the place that seemed a world away from the brutal rhythms of the plantation. That night he approached the back door and gave the signal he had been taught by a fellow runaway he had met briefly on the trail. 3 soft knocks, a pause, then 2 more. The door was opened by the farmer, a man named Jedediah. He held a lantern, and its light fell on Ezekiel's face. The man's expression was serious, compassionate, but weary. "Thee art welcome, friend," Jedediah said softly, "but thee brings trouble with thee." He led Ezekiel into the warm kitchen. His wife Sarah gave him food and warm clothes without a word, her movements calm and efficient. "Your name has preceded you," Jedediah said, sitting across the table from him. "We received word on the wire. The runaway who killed his master in Savannah. The bounty is up to $500 now. There are slave catchers, professionals, scouring the countryside for you. A man named Cain is said to be on your trail." The name sent a chill down Ezekiel's spine. He had heard whispers of Cain among the enslaved. A man, some said part Indian, who could track a whisper on the wind, whose dogs were devils bred in the swamps of hell. He was a legend, a bogeyman used to frighten potential runaways into submission. And he was real. "They say you are a monster," Jedediah continued, his clear blue eyes fixed on Ezekiel, a man of unnatural savagery. Ezekiel met his gaze. He did not speak. The warmth of the room, the smell of baking bread, the quiet kindness of these people. It was all so disorienting. He had lived in a state of primal alertness for so long he had forgotten what simple human decency felt like. "I do not see a monster," Jedediah said after a long silence. "I see a man who has been sorely tested by the evils of this world. The Lord abhors violence, but he also abhors the bondage of man. We will help you. We will hide you." They hid him in a secret compartment beneath the floorboards of the pantry, a space just big enough for a man to lie down, claustrophobic and dark. smelling of earth and smoked meats. He stayed there for a week. During the day, he lived in absolute silence, listening to the muffled sounds of the farmhouse above him, the scrape of chairs, the murmur of voices, the rhythmic thump of Sarah's churn. At night, Jedediah would let him out to stretch his legs, to eat and talk. He learned that they were part of a long chain, a secret railroad that stretched all the way to Canada. They were just one small link, a dangerous and vital one. They had helped dozens of fugitives on their way to freedom. Some had made it, some had not. We heard from a woman named Hagar. Sarah told him one night, her voice soft. She sent word through a traveling preacher. She wanted you to know that Croft came back. He burned her cabin to the ground, but she was gone. She said to tell you the root is not so easily destroyed. It just finds new ground to grow in. The news was a relief and a burden. Hagar was safe, but her life had been destroyed because of him. The ripples of his actions were spreading wider and wider, touching and changing the lives of everyone he encountered. On the seventh day, the trouble Jedediah had predicted arrived. Ezekiel was in the hiding place, the heavy pantry shelves back in their place above him. He heard the sound of multiple horses, the jingle of harnesses, the gruff voices of men. "We have it on good authority. You're harboring a fugitive, Quaker," a voice snarled. It was a voice he had not heard in months, but would never forget. Silas Croft. "We harbor no one but the Lord's grace in this house, sir," Jedediah's calm voice replied. "I have a warrant to search this property from top to bottom. This ain't your land of brotherly love. This is Carolina. We have laws. And I have a man with me who can smell a runaway through 6 feet of dirt." There was a new voice then, a low, gravelly drawl that made the hairs on Ezekiel's arms stand up. "He's here," the voice said. "I can feel him. Like a storm comin' in. This house has the stink of fear on it." Cain. Ezekiel heard them enter the house, the heavy thud of their boots on the floorboards just above his head. He heard them ransacking the rooms, overturning furniture, their voices a low, angry murmur. He lay in the darkness, his heart a frantic, trapped bird. He clutched the pearl button, its familiar shape, a small point of reality in the suffocating darkness. He could hear Sarah's quiet weeping, Jedediah's firm but futile protests. The footsteps came into the pantry. They were directly above him. "Nothing here, Cain," Croft said, his voice tight with frustration. "Patience, Croft," Cain's low voice rumbled. "A good trap needs a good lure." There was a loud crash, the sound of shelves being swept clear. Jars shattered. "Now, Quaker, I'm going to ask you one last time. Where is he? If you don't tell me, I'm going to set a fire. We'll see if your runaway can breathe smoke." Silence. Ezekiel could imagine the scene above him. Croft and this legendary slave catcher, their faces menacing. Jedediah and Sarah, standing firm in their faith, their terror masked by conviction. "The Lord is my shepherd," Jedediah's voice said, strong and clear. "I shall not want." "Have it your way," Cain growled. Ezekiel smelled it first. A whiff of smoke. They were going to do it. They were going to burn this family alive, all for him. He thought of Hagar's cabin, a pile of ash because of him. He would not let it happen again. His flight, his quest for freedom, it could not be built on the bones of good people. He made his decision. With all his strength, he pushed upward. The floorboards above him buckled, sending sacks of flour and shattered jars flying. He burst out of the floor like a man rising from the grave, covered in dust and grime, his eyes wild. The scene in the pantry was exactly as he had imagined. Croft stood with a torch in his hand, his face a mask of triumphant rage. Jedediah and Sarah stood huddled in a corner, their faces pale but resolute. And then there was Cain. He was not what Ezekiel had expected. He was a wiry man, not large, with skin the color of worn leather and beige, eyes as black and depthless as a well. He wore buckskins and carried no visible weapon but for a long, wicked-looking knife at his belt. He was watching Ezekiel with a strange, detached curiosity, like a naturalist observing a rare and dangerous insect. "There you are," Cain said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "The ghost of Savannah." For a moment, everyone was frozen. Then Croft lunged. "He's mine!" he screamed, swinging the torch. Ezekiel ducked, grabbing a heavy iron skillet from the stove. He brought it around in a wide arc, crashing it into the side of Croft's head. The overseer went down with a grunt, the torch clattering to the floor, its flames licking at a spilled sack of flour. But Cain was already moving. He was unnaturally fast, a blur of motion. He didn't rush Ezekiel. He moved to the side, blocking the doorway, his long knife now in his hand. "You and me now, Ezekiel," he said, his voice almost conversational. "Let's see if the legend is true." The flour on the floor ignited. A whoosh of flame erupted, a wall of fire that separated them from Jedediah and Sarah. The smoke was thick and acrid, instantly filling the small room. Ezekiel had no weapon but the skillet. Cain held his knife with an expert's grace, its blade weaving hypnotic patterns in the flickering firelight. This was not a fight for capture. This was a fight to the death. He lunged, not at Cain, but at the wall beside him, where a rack of cured hams hung from the rafters. He swung the skillet, smashing it against the heavy hooks. A massive, salt-cured ham broke free and swung down like a pendulum, catching Cain in the chest and sending him staggering backward. It was the opening Ezekiel needed. He didn't press the attack. He turned to Jedediah. "Get out! Through the window!" The fire was roaring now, consuming the dry wood of the old farmhouse with terrifying speed. Jedediah grabbed Sarah, pulling her toward the kitchen window. He smashed the glass with a stool and helped her climb through. He looked back at Ezekiel, his face etched with turmoil. "Go!" Ezekiel roared. "Live!" Jedediah hesitated for a second more, then scrambled out the window after his wife. Ezekiel turned back. The smoke was a black, choking cloud. He could barely see. Cain was on his feet again, his eyes glowing like embers in the gloom, a thin line of blood trickling from his mouth. He was smiling. "You're a fighter," Cain rasped, coughing. "I'll give you that." He came at Ezekiel, his knife a silver streak in the fiery darkness. Ezekiel parried the blow with the heavy skillet, the sound of steel on iron ringing out over the roar of the flames. They were a macabre dance of shadows and fire, two men locked in a primal struggle in the heart of a burning inferno. The heat was unbearable. The smoke was poison. The roof above them groaned, ready to collapse. Ezekiel knew he could not win a prolonged fight. He had to end it, or escape. He feinted high with the skillet, and when Cain raised his knife to block, Ezekiel kicked out, his bare foot connecting with Cain's knee. The man grunted in pain, his leg buckling. In that instant, Ezekiel threw the skillet with all his might. It spun through the air, catching Cain square in the face. The bounty hunter fell backward, stunned, and disappeared into the flames. Ezekiel didn't wait to see if he was dead. He turned and scrambled for the window Jedediah and Sarah had escaped through. The fire was everywhere, a living, breathing monster devouring the house. He dove through the diaset window, rolling as he hit the frozen ground outside, shards of glass tearing at his back. He lay there for a moment, gasping for air, his lungs on fire. The entire farmhouse was a blazing pyre against the night sky. Jedediah and Sarah were gone, hopefully safe. Croft lay unconscious somewhere inside. Cain was likely dead. He had done it. He had survived. He pushed himself to his feet. He was battered, bruised, and burned. But he was alive. He looked at the fire one last time, a monument to the violence that seemed to follow him everywhere. Then he turned and melted back into the woods, a lone figure moving north under a cold, indifferent moon. He reached into his pocket. The pearl button was still there, warm from the heat of the fire. He closed his fist around it and kept walking, his past a trail of fire and blood behind him, his future a vast, unknown darkness ahead. Epilogue times 1902. Boston, Massachusetts. The old woman sat in a rocking chair by the window, a thick wool blanket over her lap, watching the first snow of the season begin to fall. Her name was Hope Freeman. Her hair was a crown of silver, and her face, though lined with age, held a quiet, unshakable dignity. Her granddaughter, a young woman named Elara, sat at her feet, carefully stitching a new patch onto a well-worn family quilt. "Tell me the story again, Grandma," Elara said, not looking up from her work. "The story of the button." Hope smiled, a faint, distant expression. She reached up and touched the small, chipped pearl button that was sewn into the collar of her dress. A place of honor. She had worn it on every important occasion of her life. "It was my father's," she began, her voice a soft, melodic whisper. "It was the only thing he had left of me. I was a baby, you see, a little bird. Sparrow, he called me. We were separated by a great evil, and he kept this button with him on a long, hard journey. A journey to find a place where a man could be a man, and not a thing to be bought and sold." "Did he find it?" Elara asked, her needle pausing. She had heard the story 100 times, but she always asked. "No one knows for sure," Hope said, her eyes gazing out at the swirling snow. "The stories say he walked through fire, that he fought demons, that he crossed a river of ice into the promised land. Some say he lived a long life, a free man, up in the cold north. Others say his spirit never left the swamps, that he became a guardian, a shadow who helped others on their way to freedom." The truth was, she knew very little. She had been raised in New Orleans by a family who had purchased her and her mother. Her mother, Elara, had died when she was young, but not before filling her head with stories of a tall, proud man with a scar above his eye and a love so fierce it could burn down the world. After emancipation, Hope had spent years searching, following whispers and rumors, trying to piece together the life of the father she had never known. She had found Jedediah and Sarah's descendants in North Carolina, who told her the story of the fire. She had heard folklore from Georgia all the way to Ohio about a phantom runaway, a swamp man, who was always one step ahead of the patrols. But she had never found him. She had only the stories, and the button, which an old Quaker woman had given her, saying her grandfather had left it behind, a sign that he had made it through. A letter, discovered a decade earlier in a dusty attic in Savannah, tucked into the back of an old law book, shed a different, colder light. It was from Eleanor Hemlock to her sister, written a year after the murder. Asterisk. The search for the creature Ezekiel continues, though with little hope. Croft was badly burned in a fire in the Carolinas, and has lost his nerve for the hunt. The other man, the one they called Cain, was never found. It is presumed he perished in the flames. We must accept that justice will not be had in this lifetime. The monster has vanished from the face of the earth. But I find I can no longer sleep in this house. At night I hear him, not his footsteps, but his silence, the profound, watchful silence he always had. It is as if he is still standing in the corner of the dining room, watching us, a judgment that will never end. The stain on the carpet has been cleaned a dozen times, but I can still see it. A ghost of a ghost. Hope Freeman knew nothing of this letter. Her knowledge was woven from love and memory, not fear and ink. She looked at her granddaughter, named for the mother she barely remembered, living a free life in a new century. The journey had been worth it. The fire, the blood, the long, lonely walk north. It had all led to this. To a girl sitting in a warm room, stitching a quilt, with no master but her own will. The fight for freedom is never a single, glorious battle. It is a long, arduous journey, made one step at a time, through swamps and darkness, fueled by memory and hope. It is a debt paid by one generation so that the next might have a chance to live. Revenge is a fire that consumes, but survival, stubborn and relentless, is a seed. And from a single seed, planted in the harshest soil, and watered with tears and blood, a new world can grow. Ezekiel, the man, may have been lost to the fog of history, but Ezekiel, the idea, the unshakable belief that a human soul is worth more than any price written in a ledger, that idea had walked on, finding its home in the quiet dignity of his descendants, a legacy more enduring than any monument of stone. It lived on in the stories whispered by the fire, in the pattern of a quilt, and in the pearlescent glimmer of a tiny, chipped button.